so much. Well, we're going to talk about the birth of Christ this morning. Let's go to Luke chapter 2. And the birth of Christ, it's such a powerful event, and yet at the same time, look how God makes it so simple. I mean, the whole birth is really recorded in two verses. Luke chapter 2, verse 6, and Luke chapter 2, verse 7. They were in Bethlehem and she gave birth. And I think that's one of the things that we need to think of when we think of the record of the birth of Christ, that there's been, with good reason, in the war between darkness and light and the war between good and evil, there's been so many weird traditions set forth. I was telling people earlier before the video actually started that that I've been into the text and into commentary since 6 this morning. So a good solid 4 hours, well, 4.5 hours or so already this morning. And, reading about the conflict between truth or tradition, even for example, that the ancient tradition that when Mary gave birth, she was too holy to actually give a vaginal birth, that Jesus Christ just kind of, what would you call it? He just kind of passed out of her body. It wasn't even really a birth. He just kind of sort of appeared out there. He just passed through her body. And you just look at those traditions and you're like, wow, those are people. Those are human beings that are setting forth those traditions and then defending them. But what it does to the average person doesn't read their Bible much, and for many people, they don't have a good translation, or they don't even maybe have a Bible, and so they hear what's going on and they hear the confusion. And it's that kind of thing. That's one of the reasons that when you go to Israel, it's illegal to witness. In the United States, I can walk up to somebody and I can tell them about Jesus Christ. Hey, you want to hear about Jesus Christ? And I have the right to do that. And there's freedom of speech, and they have the right to say yes or no. In Israel, you can't do that. It's against the law. And one of the reasons that it's against the law to evangelize in Israel is because every different group and denomination comes in there with some differing idea about how you get saved. Is there salvation? What is salvation? Who is Jesus? Did he even live? Blah, blah, blah. And all it does is cause a massive confusion. So the government just said, look, that's the end of it. If somebody's curious, they'll ask. Otherwise, there's no evangelism. And what you and I want to do is distill the simple story of Christ's birth, which takes more than the text. When we're one of the things I had to learn was that there's a difference between what we need to know in the text. For example, the Bible tells us in very plain terms how to live. And the difference between, if you look at it on a scale, there's orthodoxy, which is what is right to believe, and there's orthopraxy, what is right to practice. And thankfully, it's pretty easy to get to the truth on orthopraxy. You don't steal, you don't lie, you don't commit adultery, you don't covet, you do pray, you do give of your material possessions, you do fellowship with other Christians. Orthopraxy, thankfully, is quite easy, and that's why so many Christians can get together and agree on that. Orthodoxy, on the other hand, the devil is constantly trying to sow confusion into the text. And I got one of those phone calls this morning from a guy that's been listening to Christian TV, and he's all confused. And basically I had to say, look, you got to turn off your TV and just read. In fact, just read the REV translation, especially around this stuff. We've worked really hard to get it right. And if you're stuck on something, then read the commentary. So what I'd like to do is I want to start by just reading the first 7 verses of Luke chapter 2. Then we'll go back and we'll unpack those verses. The birth of Christ, there's really kind of 2 stories to the birth of Christ. There's the traditional story, which is kind of cold, harsh, unloving, and as you think it through, harsh and unloving on a number of fronts, not just that Joseph and Mary were turned away in Bethlehem, but other things as well, which we'll talk about. Whereas the true story of the birth of Christ is warm and love-filled and full of sacrifice and full of giving. And it's a wonderful, inspiring story. So verse 1 says, now it came to pass in those days and this is when Elizabeth and Mary were pregnant, came to pass in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus to register all the inhabited world for taxation. And the register of the world, and basically the reason to do that was to make sure the tax rolls were fine. And that's one of the functions of the Roman government, and the system that the Roman government set up was to maintain peace and stability in the empire, so the taxes would keep rolling in. Verse 2, this first registration took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. And we would think that that would help us a lot with the date of the birth of Christ. But actually, then we find out that Quirinius was governor of Syria twice. And, this was, I should mention this at this point. I used to be very dogmatic about Jesus Christ being born on Tishri 1 in the fall, which would have translated to our September 11th at that time. And the more I get into the text and really look at what does the text actually say, it's amazing to me, not only does the text not tell us the day that Christ was born, but the information around it is very obscure. Like what happened with me in my past was we started in Revelation. We made some assumptions about what Revelation was saying about the heaven. And then based on those assumptions, we came up with a date. And then based on those assumptions, we went to Luke chapter 1, where Zechariah, the priest Zechariah, is of the priestly course of Abijah. The priestly course serves twice a year. And we then said, well, what he had to be serving in the spring so that Jesus Christ could be born, John the Baptist, and then Jesus Christ born in the fall, and that kind of thing. But that's an assumption too. There are early church fathers and some evidence that Jesus Christ was not even born in September. And as I look at things like this, where God had an opportunity to tell us even really the month in which Christ was born. Christ was born in the month Tishri. Christ was born in the month Nisan. Whatever it is, you go back in the King's period and you get dates like that all the time, and there's just nothing. And so all of a sudden I'm asking myself, why? God could have made it quite clear. And not only did he not make it clear, but it's almost like there's times like this where he could have made it a bunch clearer and he didn't. So what's going on here? And I think that God is sending us a message here that don't get stuck on the when, get stuck on the what, that Christ is born. And that's what's important. And we heard so much in the manifestations today about go talk, that what God wants us to do, trust in me, walk forth, walk in love. I'll give you the words to speak. Be the witnesser for somebody else. Over and over again, there were at least 3 times this morning God told us to go and speak. And we really want to do that. And what we're speaking about is that Jesus Christ, the Redeemer, the Savior, is born, and he's going to save me and he's going to save you. So anyway, that's kind of my lecture about why I'm not stuck on the fall date for the birth of Christ, or Tishri 1 at this point. I'm learning to hold that much softer in my hand. So the empire wants money, so they have a taxation. It tells us that this registration for taxation took place while Quirinius was governing Syria, but then it doesn't tell you which time he's governing. Verse 3, and everyone went to be registered, each to his own city, and this would be the city of your origin. And when it says that everyone went to be registered, this was not something that came down, where you had just like a week or something to do this. This would be a period of months that people would have a chance to go back, get registered, and that kind of thing, which actually for Israel, for the observant Jews that would go to Jerusalem, at least once a year anyway. The Old Testament law said 3 times a year, but very, very few people actually went 3 times a year unless you lived close to Jerusalem. It was much more normal in the first century culture that people would go 1 time a year. And so people would go to be registered, and that also good time to do that is when there's a feast. And so Joseph, verse 4, also went up from Galilee And whenever you were going to Jerusalem or that area, it was always going up. Now, in this case, because Jerusalem is in the hill country, it actually was going up. But they talked in the Bible about going up because that was the spiritual high place of Israel. So Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth into Judea, to the city of David that is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David. So let's stop there and unpack that. So here's Joseph, and he's going to travel from Nazareth into Judea. And notice how Bethlehem here is called the city of David. Now, it's called the city of David, obviously, because David was born there. What's intriguing is that the phrase the city of David occurs twice in the New Testament. And both times it refers to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem. But if you go back in the Old Testament, almost every time the phrase the city of David is used, it refers to Jerusalem, because David, he was in Bethlehem. Of course, he was born there, but then he, ran from Saul, and he lived in all these different places, and he hid in the wilderness, and he was crowned king in Hebron, not Bethlehem, by the Judeans. And then he and his army went and conquered Jerusalem. And then when he conquered Jerusalem and made that his capital, Jerusalem became the city of David. And so if you look up the phrase the city of David in the Old Testament, it almost exclusively refers to Jerusalem. And yet people understood that that was the birthplace of David. And they also understood that the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. That was in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. So here, when the New Testament talks about the city of David, it's talking about Bethlehem. And that tells us something, because every once in a while you hear a minister or somebody teach, and they're like, yeah, Bethlehem was a little dinky, out of the way place. Nobody really knew about it. Sleepy little town. That just simply wasn't the case. What I'd like to do is I want to share my screen, because I want to talk about a couple different things here. I want to go to a map. So you're now looking at a map of Palestine, of Israel. And we can start in the north, and I know you can't see these very well, but I'm going to blow the map up in a second. But you start up in the north with Damascus, and this is a map, and again, I'll blow it up in a second, but this is a map of major trade routes in Palestine. And it becomes very important, and it's one of the things that I'm upset about with the Oxford Bible Atlas, was that the first, second, and third editions of the Oxford Bible Atlas had this map and these trade routes portrayed. And then the fourth edition came out and they took it out, and it's really too bad. So if you're getting an Oxford Bible Atlas at this point in time, I think this map is important enough that I would buy the third edition over the fourth edition at this point in my life. So want to blow this up here. Let's see. I got this stop. Oh gosh. Wait a minute. I'm going to stop sharing a second, because the black bar about sharing appeared over my map, and now I can't. So now I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to move my map over. And now I'm hoping that when that little black bar appears, that I'm gonna try. See, do you guys see the map now? You don't see the map.
Yes, we do. I do.
It's a small pop-up.
Okay, great. That's fine. Yeah, I just want to make sure you guys can see the map, because that black bar at the top that comes up and says sharing your screen covered my ability to enlarge the map. So what we've got is we've got Damascus up here. I'm going to start blowing up the map at this point, and I trust you can see the red lines a little better now. So here's
John, can you maximize your window that the map is in? Because it's really, there you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Appreciate that.
That's better.
Yeah, and so now my little thing is covered up again, but so be it, as long as you guys can see this. So here's Damascus way in the north, and basically Damascus was one of those things like all roads lead to Rome and all roads led through Damascus. So you had a road that came down, a major trade road that came down north of the Sea of Galilee. There was a fork in here that isn't on this map that came right through Capernaum, which is one of the reasons Christ made Capernaum his headquarters, because so many people would be traveling through there. And then for those of you that have been on the Bible Lands trip with me and have gone through the Wadi Hammam, you go by the Sea of Galilee, walk through the Wadi Hammam and walk down, and here's Nazareth right here, right on that trade route coming all the way down from Nazareth. I mean, from Damascus. But you could come down. And so what Joseph has got to do is he's got to get from Nazareth here down to Bethlehem. So here's Bethlehem, 7 miles south of Jerusalem. And notice that when you're going to travel, there's going to be, by the time you get to Jerusalem, now, if you're going to go to Egypt, you've got two major ways to do it. One is you can swing to the west, hit the way of the Philistines, or the way of the sea, what was in Latin is called the Via Maris, that goes down into Egypt. Or you could come out of Jerusalem straight south, go through Bethlehem, down through Hebron, which is right here. In that point, the road broke, and you could head to Beersheba and then on down to Egypt. Or from Hebron, you could go to the east and go down to the area down here, Arad, and then get on this road and go over into Arabia and the major spice areas. So here's Joseph now, and he's in Nazareth. So let me go back up to Nazareth. So there it is. So there's Nazareth at the point of the arrow, and Joseph's got to go to Bethlehem. Now, he can do this one of two ways. It's going to save him a little bit of walking if he takes the major road right over the hill country. You could see this red road right here. And you can take this major red road through the hill country right to Jerusalem. There's a major problem with that is it goes right through the heart of Samaria, and the Samaritans hated the Jews and the Jews hated the Samaritans. And you as a traveler, you could be very easily in more danger in this area. Also, if anything happened and you needed support, it would be much harder for you to get any support going on this road. Jesus did take it on one of his itineraries, but he didn't often take it. It's much more likely that what Joseph did is he dropped down into the Jordan Valley and took the main road on the west side of the Jordan Valley, which would run all the way down to Jericho. And then he would take what we know as the Jericho Road, the 3,000 feet, a little over 3,000 feet, right up to Jerusalem, and then pick up the main route that goes to Bethlehem right here. So then the question being is, here's the scripture that says, Joseph went from Galilee, from Nazareth, to the city that's called Bethlehem, because he was a family line of David, and and you're like, okay, what's to know about that? Well, what's to know about that is this distance is 65 miles. And this walk is uphill for about 15 miles. And it's an uphill climb of something like I said, 3,000 to 3,500 feet. And so if the King James Version says Mary is great with child. Now the text doesn't say that. We'll get into that, but the text doesn't say that. But Joseph loved Mary, and he knew Mary was carrying the promised Messiah. So the question is he going to take a pregnant woman, an obviously very pregnant woman, is he going to take her on this journey, which ordinarily would take 3 days? Because women, as you know, in their last days of pregnancy are not comfortable. In fact, I'm kind of living in that right now, because Genevieve's brother, who lives about 10 miles from us, was due yesterday, not her brother, but her brother's wife was due yesterday. And Cynthia has been an absolute trooper throughout her pregnancy, but Genevieve, of course, is anxious as all get out. So she's constantly checking in for updates. And so the report yesterday came in, and here's Cyn, and this is her due date. And she's been such a trooper. And the report was, well, she's not very comfortable. Yeah, I guess not. That's like the super understatement, that she's not very comfortable. Now, Joseph loved Mary, and he's not going to take her in that state on this journey for a couple different reasons. One, he knew he loved Mary, and he knew she was carrying the promised Messiah. But two, they didn't know. Today it's like we know yesterday was sin's due date. Well, they didn't know that in the ancient world. Labor came suddenly and often without warning. They knew approximately, and they could tell it's getting close. But here's Mary. What happens if she's halfway here? God forbid if she's down here in the midst of Samaria with all the Samaritans, and she gives birth on the trail. What are you going to do then? See, Joseph would never take that chance. The logic is simply against that. So I'm going to stop sharing and go back to the text here. And here's Joseph, and he went up from Galilee, from Nazareth into Judea to the city of David that's called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David. Verse 5, to be registered along with Mary, who had been betrothed to him and was pregnant. And the word betrothed is why in the Gospel of Matthew that Mary is called Joseph's wife, because a betrothal in that culture was strong enough that it had to be dissolved by divorce. See, being engaged in our culture isn't that strong. But in the biblical culture, if you were betrothed, if you were engaged, as we would say, then it was a strong enough commitment that it had to be broken by divorce, which is why Matthew says that Joseph was considering divorcing her, even though they had not come together. And the reason here that it would say that Mary, he was betrothed to her, is they hadn't had sex yet. And we'll learn from Matthew chapter 1 that they won't have sex until after the Messiah was actually born. So registered along with Mary. Believe it or not, somebody just walked in unexpectedly, trying to wave them off. Sorry about that. To be registered along with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was pregnant. And the Christmas tradition, of course, is that Mary arrived in Bethlehem, and the night she came or arrived in Bethlehem, she gave birth. But that's not in the text. The word pregnant here in Greek is ekouo, which is a combination of two words, in, the Greek word en, which means in, and kuo, which is the womb. So literally, she has a child in the womb. That's what the text is saying here. And it just means pregnant. And the modern versions read pregnant. But the King James Version says great with child. Why would it do that? Well, they didn't know the Greek as well in 1611. That is true. But it's also true that the translators would have been influenced by the Christmas story. And so they translate it great with child, but you won't generally find that in any of the modern versions. So what do we know from Luke chapter 2, verses 4 and 5? That Joseph knew Mary was pregnant, knew she was carrying the given Messiah, and he's not going to risk her giving birth on the roadside. He's not going to risk her health, and he's not going to make her uncomfortable. He's going to travel to Bethlehem when traveling is comfortable for Mary and safe for him. And he went there to be registered with Mary, to whom he was betrothed, and Mary was pregnant. And then verse 6 is very simple. It just says, now it came to pass while they were there, the days were fulfilled for her to give birth. And that's really all it says. Verse 7, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. And then the verse goes on. This is very, very standard writing, and it's very simple. And nobody at the time expected anyone to give the details of this birth. The whole story about the stable and giving birth alone and all of that came about as traditions that were developed in Europe, where with Europe, the whole way of life was very different from the way of life in Palestine. If we just take a look at Luke chapter 1, just go to Luke chapter 1, verse 57. Because Luke chapter 1, of course, there were no chapters in the original text. So Luke chapter 1, verse 57, and Luke chapter 2, verses 6 and 7 aren't that far apart in the text. And notice how in Luke chapter 1, verse 57, it simply says, now Elizabeth's time was fulfilled for her to give birth, and she bore a son. And that's very simple. And nobody would heap a bunch of assumptions on this, like, well, Elizabeth doesn't mention any midwives, doesn't mention any women helping Elizabeth, so she must have been alone. Wonder if Zachariah was with her. And all of a sudden you'd have all these wild speculations that have nothing to do with truth. You know, birth in villages happened all the time, and there was a standard operating procedure for them. The men would leave, the village midwife would come, there would be other wise women there who would help out, and experienced women, and they would help out with the birth. And when the baby was born and was safe and was taken care of, and when the mother was decently modest, then the women would come out and tell the men they could come back in and see the baby and that kind of thing. And that's if you go through the scripture and look at women giving birth, Luke 1:57 is about standard. She bore a son. Yes, that's about all it'll ever say. And so when we go to Luke chapter 2, and it says, now it came to pass while they were there, the days were fulfilled for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. There's a lot just in there about what we know from the culture that would never be expressed in the text. You know, there's we're going to learn as we examine this. She wasn't born she didn't give birth the night that they arrived. She didn't give birth in a stable. She gave birth in a family home. So basically, verse 6, it says, now it came to pass while they were there. How long does that mean? How long would Joseph and Mary have been there? Well, Joseph obviously could tell that Mary was becoming more and more pregnant, you know, the telling baby bump type of thing. And so Joseph and Mary would be making plans to travel before she became uncomfortable, not even knowing exactly when that labor would occur. They're going to give that plenty of time. I would say a minimum of a few weeks, a minimum of a few weeks. Could have been 6 weeks, could have been 2 months. The Bible doesn't tell us. It simply says while they were there. What it clearly doesn't say is when they arrived. It doesn't say now it came to pass when they arrived. It's while they were there. And thankfully, and there's an interesting lesson here if you want to study the commentaries, because the commentaries that will write on this almost all agree that she would have been there a while before giving birth. But the difference between scholarship and what's believed and taught in just your average church can be really different. So it came to pass while they were there, while they're in Bethlehem, the days were fulfilled for her to give birth. And then it says, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. And it was always a blessing in the biblical culture to have children. And one of the things that it's kind of because we get so focused on Mary and Jesus that we forget that Jesus was Mary's firstborn son. She had 4 other sons. Let's just go see them. They're in Matthew chapter 13. So let's go to Matthew chapter 13. And in Matthew chapter 13, while Jesus Christ was preaching in Nazareth, the people wondered where he got his knowledge and his mighty works. In verse 55 of Matthew 13:55, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, and his sisters? Are they not all with us? So Mary had Jesus and then 4 other sons and at least 2 daughters. So you're looking at a woman that's given birth to 7 children. And if you think about Mary at, say, if she was married at, or somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 when she got impregnated, then, you say, okay, 7 children. If we give them each a year and a half space between the children, you're talking at least 10 years. She's going to be in her mid-20s, and she may have had more daughters than that. I mean, that's like a low guesstimate at 2 daughters. She might have had more than 2 daughters. So Mary, for her young adult life anyway, was pregnant most of the time, and had the child. And that's where in verse 7, she gave birth to her firstborn son. And now, when we're talking about truth or tradition, it's amazing the degree to which people that are trying to back the tradition, Mary's a virgin, she can't give birth, all these type of things, will go to get rid of this and try to explain it away in any number of ways. But for us, it's very simple. We just accept the text. Mary and Joseph had Jesus, and then Joseph and Mary started having sexual intercourse, and then Mary got pregnant like she normally would, and she had other children. Okay, that's Mary, and she would have been a great mom, and I'm sure she raised all those children. It does open the door for some interesting speculation about, what I'm sure Joseph and Mary were very sensitive about the rest of the children. I was thinking today, that, for example, you could see here's James and he's chewing with his mouth open, and Joseph kind of goes, James, don't chew with your mouth open. Your brother Jesus never chews with his mouth open, or you get something like, where they in the nighttime, they didn't have beds per se. They just had what you and I would know as like a sleeping bag thing that they would roll out, and you could just see, here's Simon and he's sleeping in, and Joseph is like, Simon, get out of bed. Your brother Jesus never sleeps in. We have no idea what family life would have been like with brother Jesus, but I'm sure that Joseph and Mary were very sensitive to make sure that all of those children were well supported. And of course, James, as we know by the middle of Acts, and the apostle James was killed. Then James, the brother of Jesus, took over the church. So they were well raised and well trained. So she gives birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling cloth. And the swaddling cloth was just cloth to keep the child feeling secure and warm. And then it doesn't talk about other traditions that they would typically do, like they would typically touch the child with some salt, and typically pray over the child and bless the child. But those things were so typical, they wouldn't be named. And similarly, when it says she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloth, she's going to give birth in a normal village way. And then it says, laid him in a manger because there was no space for them in the guest room. And the traditional reading, of course, is there was no room for them in the inn. Now, the word space is the Greek word topos or tapas. And tapas means it's a space, a place. It doesn't refer to a room like we think of a hotel room. And this becomes very important. I mean, the Greek word tapas is so common that it occurs over 90 times in the New Testament. And this is the only place that it's translated room. It's astounding that there's so much traditional angst behind translating this word room when it occurs over 90 times and it's never translated room anywhere else, because it doesn't mean room. It's space. It would be space in a room or simply a place, like when it says Jesus Christ went into a desert place and prayed. That's the word tapas. It's simply a space in a room. There was no space. And then guest room, the word guest room is the word kataluma. Now there's the word in is pandokion, and it does occur in the text. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of the, what do they call it? The parable of the Good Samaritan. And here's this guy, and he's going on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, which we've already seen on a map. So this guy's walking down that very road, and he gets mugged, and he's left there bleeding and naked. He was stripped and beaten up, and all of his stuff was stolen. And the muggers went away, and a Samaritan comes by and binds his wounds up and carries him to an inn, a pandokion, and that's also in Luke. So Luke uses the word kataluma, Luke, which is the word here. Luke uses the word pandokion, which is the word that means inn, when Christ is looking for a guest room in which to hold the Last Supper. And he tells his disciples, you're going to see a man, he's going to show you a guest room where we can eat, then that word is kataluma. So guest room is kataluma, and that's what it should be. And so here the scripture says they laid Jesus in a manger because there was no space in the guest room. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us why there's no space in the guest room. It may have been full with other people who'd come for registration. It may have been full with people who came for a feast or for other things. The Bible doesn't tell us. It's not germane to the story. But in any case, there wasn't any space in the guest room. But what does that have to do with laying him in a manger? Why would the scripture say they laid him in a manger? Because there was no space in the guest room. What's the deal with that? Well, the guest room would never have a manger, because a manger is a trough for feeding animals. The guests, if they brought their animals, they wouldn't march them into your house and put them in your guest room. They put them with your animals, where your animals are, in the main room of the house. And that's where the manger was. So here the Bible is explaining to the Middle Eastern people, why Christ would be in a manger, because it was like, wow, Christ is in a manger, there'd be no manger in a guest room. Why are they talking about that? And then you find out, well, why is he laid in a manger? Well, where is the manger? Well, the manger is in the main part of the house. Why is the manger in the main part of the house? Because if you had a goat, a milk goat, if you had a couple of sheep, if you had a donkey, you didn't leave them outside at night. It was far too dangerous. They'd be hurt by animals or they'd get stolen. So you brought your animals into your house at night. And there's ample evidence for that in the history of the ancient Near East. In fact, even when Saul went to see the witch at Endor, the prophetess at Endor, the medium there, when the medium killed the calf to give Saul some food, it said she had the calf with her in the house. And that was very, very common at the time. So here, Jesus Christ is born, and he's born and laid in a manger, which is in the house, because there wasn't any space in the guest room. Well, where did the idea come that there was no room in the inn? First of all, again, when you're in 1611, I could understand the translation. When the Bible headquarters moved from the Middle East to Europe, everybody, and naturally so, everybody began thinking in terms of Europe and how Europe works. And we think in terms of how America works. And a manger, an animal manger wasn't in your house. An animal manger was in the stable. And so you'd have Christ and he'd be born in a stable. So now we have, we've got a December birth. We've got Christ born in a stable. Why would he be born in the stable? Well, there must not be any room in the Cataluma. They weren't as close, they weren't as knowledgeable in those early centuries as we are now. Well, there's no room in the inn. Why the translators didn't pick up on the word topos and get that it was a space is due to their lack of understanding of biblical culture. And I think just being overly influenced by the Christian tradition itself, because just knowing that the topos was a space should have directed them away from the idea that there was a room. Now I want to put pressure on another thing here. If there was no space in, let's say it was the word inn. She laid him in a manger because there was no space in the inn. Would Joseph have taken his wife to an inn under any circumstances? And I'm going to say no, because in my study of biblical customs, when you rented to stay in an inn or a khan or a caravanserai, whatever you want to call it, you didn't get a room. What you got was a space on the floor to sleep. And you see, by the time that translations were being done, the King James translation, Tyndale's translation, Wycliffe's translation, the Geneva translation, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, all those translations from the 15 and 1600s, when they were being done, they did not know, they didn't have the information on how inns worked. And so they, and in the Middle Ages, inns worked the way hotel rooms work for us. You rent a room. But that's not the way they worked in the ancient world or in the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, you go to an inn and then you get a space like about, a size of a sleeping bag or maybe a little more that you can sleep in and put your luggage in while you're there to keep it safe. And that's what you got. Well, what about the rest of the room? Well, the innkeepers, they're in the business to make money. They're not in the business to make you comfortable. You got comfortable, you got a place to sleep on the floor. So the innkeeper is going to fill that up with whoever and whatever he can. So, it might be some guy who actually wants to sleep. It might be some guy who wants a prostitute. It might be there's all kinds of things that could happen in the room. You could end up with a small party in that room. There's no privacy for Mary to give birth, especially if it was so crowded that they're going to teach there was no room in the inn. I mean, even if there had been, my point is that even if there had been room, if Joseph and Mary would have never gone to a public inn. In the Roman Empire, I've read customs books that in the Roman Empire, the innkeepers were so really dishonest. The Roman Senate, one of the dishonest things that the Roman innkeepers used to do is they used to sneak into the gladiator arenas and take some of the dead bodies if they could get away with them, and then butcher them up and cook them because it's free meat. So it's pure profit. And the Roman Senate actually had to pass laws that it was illegal for innkeepers to steal dead gladiator bodies and cook them. The inns were very, very rough places, and Jesus, and Mary and Joseph wouldn't have ever gone there. So here they get to Bethlehem. They're there. They would have been taken into the home of a nice couple. Why? Well, number one, because they were from that area. They would have known family, just like Mary knew Elizabeth and Zechariah, who were from the area. Secondly, they would have been taken in because they were royals. They were both from the house of David. Thirdly, they would have been taken in because Mary needed help. She was a young woman who was pregnant. And in all societies, those women are given special help. And then how do we know that's probably what happened? Because when the shepherds showed up, and I can just see, the angels came in force. First of all, it was an angel that showed up to the shepherds, but then it was a whole blasted army of angels that show up, and there's a great light. And they made it very clear to the angels that the Messiah that you've been waiting on since Adam and Eve has just been born in Bethlehem. And those shepherds wanted the Messiah to come like I want the rapture to come. They were like, oh my gosh, the Messiah is finally here. The world's going to get straightened out. If they went and saw Jesus Christ and he wasn't in absolutely the best of circumstances, I'm sure they would have been confused. They would have been outraged. They would have been scandalized. And they would have just said, hey, you guys got to leave the stable thing and come with us. Instead, there's no word of that at all. They saw the baby and they were excited and they told the world about it. So what do we have? We have Mary in verse 7 giving birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling cloth, laid him in a manger, which was in the main part of the house. There wasn't any space in the guest room. And so a loving family opened their home to them, their actual living quarters, to this young couple and Mary. And that's where she would have given birth. And the night she did go give birth, when she gave, and how do we know it was at night? Because when the angels appeared to the shepherds at night, they said, this day has been born to you. And the daytime started with sunset. So Mary gave birth at night. And she would have given birth in the same way that everybody had given birth for millennium. All the men would have left and would have been out on the street, or if it was cold, they would have been in a neighbor's house. But generally speaking, they'd just be out in the street. They'd build a bonfire and they'd be waiting for news on the birth of the baby. And then inside the house, there'd be Mary and the village midwife and some other women. And people say, well, it doesn't say those women were there. You're right. It doesn't say it with Elizabeth or anybody else either. It's just standard operating procedure of how babies were born in that culture. And then when the child was born, a woman would come out of the house and tell the men whether it was a baby girl or a baby boy. In the birth of a baby girl, everybody just simply, maybe nodded at the father or, said some kind of nice, kind word, and then they all left. And there was no celebration. And why was there no celebration if a girl was born? Because a girl would take wealth from the family. When the girl married, age 12 to 14, maybe as late as 15, but rarely. But when a girl married, she left her parents' house just about the time she was really getting to the point that she could be capable and supporting and that kind of thing, and understanding more as a young woman and less as a child. Here she goes and she leaves the house. And if the man she was engaged to was in another village, she might not see her mom and dad except maybe at the feasts in Jerusalem. Maybe her mom and dad would make a trip over and see her, type of thing. But the woman would leave the house, and any children that she would bear would be children that would belong to the clan of the father, not the clan of the mother. And not only that, but she even took a dowry. In the European world, it's the man who gives a dowry to the woman, but in the biblical world, the woman gave a dowry. So the woman was raised by her parents, but then left. Any children she had belonged to the father's clan, and she took money from the family with her to give to the father's family. So the birth of a baby girl was not celebrated. The baby would have been loved and cared for, but the birth wasn't celebrated. In contrast, the birth of a baby boy, the boy added strength to the family. His wife, when he married, would build the clan by giving birth to children. It brought money into the family by the dowry coming in. So the birth of a baby boy was a huge, very noisy celebration. And that would have been going on in the street. And so the idea of silent night, holy night, well, it wasn't. It was a great, giant, noisy celebration in the street. So when we take a look at what's really going on at the birth of Christ, it's such a redeeming, love-filled story where Joseph cares about Mary so much. He's not going to travel with her when she's uncomfortable. He's going to take care of her, and he's going to love her, and he's going to travel when she can travel comfortably and safely. And then they get to Bethlehem. They're taken into the home of a family that won't even inconvenience their guests by asking them to leave the guest room for a pregnant woman. Instead, they open their own family living quarters to this young family, and they let them stay there until Mary gives birth. And when Mary starts going into labor, all of the men, like they would always do, would just get up and leave the house and go be in the street. And Mary would have all the time she needed. And you know that sometimes labor and birth takes a number of hours. It can take more than a day. And those men would just be gone. They would just simply recuse themselves and let the women be able to let Mary give birth in peace and in privacy. And then when the baby was born, it would be dedicated and laid in a manger, which would be perfect size for it, keep him out of the cold and away from busy streets. And there'd be a noisy celebration to celebrate the birth of a child. And that's what would have happened on the night of Christ's birth. And that's what we need to celebrate when we're talking about Christmas and the night of Christ's birth. And then, the overriding, just sacrificial nature and nature of giving that's embedded into the Christmas story then comes forward to us as we move into the Christmas season and how we can give and bless. And I love James's prophecy about, God needs us to share his love. God needs us to share the story. That's giving and sacrifice on our part. And it's right in the flow of the whole Christmas story. So thank you, and God bless you for being with me this morning. I trust that this has been a blessing to you.